When you hear the word Sparta, an image just snaps into your head, doesn't it?
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
immediate. It's the red cloak, the big round shield, the whole phalanx moving as one.
A perfect machine.
It's a society that feels like it was carved out of granite, just unyielding, disciplined, and, completely fearless.
It's the ultimate brand, really. It's what scholars now call the Spartan Mirage,
Mm.
an image of a society that somehow solved the problem of human chaos and messiness.
Exactly. But today, we're not really looking at the soldiers in the line. We are trying to find the architect, the man who supposedly designed this whole machine from the ground up. We're talking about the lawgiver, Lycurgus.
Lycurgus is the alpha and the omega of the Spartan story. I mean, if you read the ancient texts, Plutarch, Xenophon, he isn't just a founding father. He's the creator of their good order, the
Right.
eunomia,
Everything.
everything. The Senate, the bizarre education system, the austere lifestyle, even the military focus. It's all traced back to his singular genius.
But, and this is really where my reading for this deep dive just went completely off the rails, Lycurgus is a paradox. He's the most important figure in Spartan history, but when you actually try and find any hard evidence of his life, he evaporates.
And that is the central tension we're going to be dealing with. Lycurgus is completely essential to Sparta. You literally cannot explain the city without him. And yet we know absolutely nothing certain about him.
Nothing.
We don't know when he lived. We don't know for sure which laws he actually put in place. And there's a very strong, very respectable academic argument that he never existed at all.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're trying to unpack that. How does a society build a ghost to justify its own existence? We're pulling from Herodotus, Xenophon, Plutarch, Aristotle, all the heavy hitters, to see if we can separate the man from the myth.
And to do that, we have to start with the most basic biographical fact you could ask for. When was he born?
I tried to pin this down, and it was a complete nightmare. I'm used to history having, some fuzziness around the edges, but this is next level.
It's a chronological catastrophe. I mean, if you look at Xenophon, who's writing in the 4th century BC, and he actually lived in Sparta for years, he knew them well, he places Lycurgus way, way back in the 11th century BC.
The 11th century, that's the sub-Mycenaean period. That's the Greek Dark Ages. We're practically in the age of myth at that point.
Exactly. Xenophon is linking him to the Heraclids, the supposed descendants of Hercules, right at the moment of the legendary invasion of the Peloponnese.
So he's making him ancient on purpose.
He wants Lycurgus's laws to feel eternal, like they've been there from the very beginning. But then you get other historians, like Ephorus or Eratosthenes, who are trying to be more scientific. They're using king lists to calculate dates mathematically.
And what do they come up with?
They place him much later, around 885 BC.
Okay, so we've already jumped forward a good 200 years. But Thucydides, who is usually the guy we all trust for the real history, he implies the Spartan reforms happened even later, maybe around 804 BC.
So the timeline is already a wreck. And then it gets even more complicated because of Aristotle. Aristotle cites a very specific artifact he claims to have seen with his own eyes at Olympia. It's called the Disc of Iphidos.
This is the bronze disc, right? The one that had the terms of the Olympic truce inscribed on it.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And according to Aristotle, Lycurgus's name was carved right there on that disc next to the name of King Iphidos.
Okay, so that should settle it then.
Well, the first Olympics were traditionally held in 776 BC. So if Lycurgus's name is on that disc, he has to be alive in 776.
So now we have a spread from the 11th century all the way down to the 8th. That's a gap of over 300 years. I mean, if I told you a major political figure lived either during the Black Plague or the American Revolution, you'd assume I was making him up.
And the ancient Greeks realized this. It drove them absolutely crazy. They couldn't reconcile the timelines. The historian Timaeus, he actually proposed a solution that I find delightfully desperate.
What was it?
He suggested there must have been 2 different men named Lycurgus.
The old evil twin theory.
Basically. He argued there was an old, ancient Lycurgus who was the military reformer, and then a younger, different Lycurgus who was the diplomat at the Olympics. It was the only way they could make the math work without admitting their entire history was broken.
But let's go back to that disc of Iphidos for a second. I mean, Aristotle, seeing a name on a physical object, that sounds like hard evidence. Why don't modern historians just accept the 776 BC date and move on?
Because of the context. You have to think about when Aristotle was looking at this disc. This is the 4th century BC. The people who ran the Olympic Games were, frankly, desperate to establish their own authority.
What do you mean?
They wanted to prove that the sacred truce of the Games was older and more important than the constant brutal wars between the Greek city-states.
So, they faked a signature.
It is highly probable. I mean, if you want people to respect your truths, what do? You claim it was signed by the two most legendary figures of the past, the Phaedos of Elis and Lycurgus of Sparta. It's a classic appeal to authority. The disc was likely a prop created centuries later to legitimize the games.
So the physical evidence is probably just really good ancient PR.
Probably.
But there's another piece of evidence, or maybe a lack of evidence, that feels even more damning to me. You mentioned the poet Tyrtaeus.
Yes. Tyrtaeus is our earliest contemporary source for Sparta. He was a poet writing in the 7th century BC, right in the middle of the Second Messenian War, this huge society-defining conflict.
And his poetry is all about Sparta.
All of it. It's about the discipline, the phalanx, the need to obey the laws, to die for the state. It's the ultimate Spartan propaganda.
And he doesn't mention the founder.
Not once. Not a single time. He talks about the laws coming from Apollo at Delphi. He talks about the kings. But the name Lycurgus is completely, totally absent.
That feels impossible. If Lycurgus was the George Washington of Sparta, the man who designed the entire system, how does the national poet, writing just a century or so after he supposedly lived, fail to drop his name?
It is the smoking gun for the non-existence theory. It strongly suggests that Lycurgus is what historians call a retrojection.
A retrojection.
The Spartan system didn't happen all at once in some flash of genius. It evolved slowly, painfully over centuries of war and crisis. But later generations, they didn't want to admit that. They wanted a clean, simple origin story.
Because it's messy to say, we figured this out through centuries of bloody trial and error. It's so much more powerful to say, a godlike man gave us the perfect laws, and we must never, ever change them.
Precisely. By the 6th or 5th century, Sparta is a superpower. They need a symbol to anchor their unique identity. So they take a minor local hero, or maybe an old cult figure named Lycurgus, and they elevate him into the architect of everything.
But even if he is a fiction, the story they told about him is fascinating. It's a very specific kind of fiction. It tells us what the Spartans wanted to believe about themselves.
Oh, absolutely. It follows the classic lawgiver archetype, almost beat for beat. A hero's journey.
So let's walk through that life. Because Plutarch writes this biography that reads like a novel. It starts with this idea that Lycurgus had supreme power, but he refused it.
Right. He's born into one of the two royal houses, the Eurypontids. His older brother, the king, dies. Lycurgus is next in line to the throne, but his brother's widow is pregnant.
And she gives birth to a boy.
She gives birth to a boy, Churlos. And Lycurgus, in a public display, immediately declares the infant the new king and sets himself up as regent or guardian.
And this is where the political intrigue kicks in. The queen mother, his sister-in-law, she approaches him in secret and suggests they get rid of the baby.
Right. She says, let's kill him. You can be king and I'll be your queen.
Which is pretty standard operating procedure in a lot of ancient courts, to be honest.
It is, but Lycurgus is portrayed as being horrified. He pretends to agree with her just to save the child, but then at a big public banquet, he brings the baby out and proclaims him king.
A very dramatic moment.
Very. But he knows that even with this public display, rumors are going to spread. If that child dies of an illness, if he has an accident, everyone will point the finger at Lycurgus.
So he has to leave. He goes into voluntary exile to prove his loyalty.
He takes the grand tour. And this is a crucial part of the myth. The lawgiver must leave his own society to gain the wisdom and perspective needed to fix it. He goes to Crete. He travels to Asia Minor. Some stories even have him going as far as Egypt or India.
He's comparison shopping for political technology.
That's a great way to put it. In Crete, he studies their austere communal meals and their military discipline. In Ionia, he sees the effects of luxury and decides it's a poison. In Egypt, he supposedly learns the value of separating the warrior caste from everyone else. He's gathering the ingredients for Sparta.
And of course, while he's gone, Sparta completely collapses.
It descends into anomia lawlessness. The kings are weak, the people are disobedient, society's just fraying at the seams. And this sets up the necessary condition for his return. The people have to want the order he brings. They literally beg him to come back.
But he doesn't come back with a clipboard and a suggestion box. He comes back with basically a coup.
He returns in secret, gathers 30 of the most powerful men in the city, and they occupy the agora, the marketplace at dawn, fully armed.
The young king, his own nephew Charolaus, he actually runs and hides in a temple because he thinks it's an assassination attempt.
Which tells you a lot about the state of Spartan politics at the time, doesn't it? But Lycurgus isn't there to kill the king. He's there to co-opt him into his new system. He establishes his new laws. But, and this is a detail from Plutarch that I just love, it wasn't an instant success. The wealthy elite absolutely hated him.
Of course they did. He was taking away their power and their luxuries.
He was rendering their wealth completely useless. And Plutarch tells this incredibly vivid story of the eye gouging. The rich citizens form a mob, and they chase Lycurgus right out of the marketplace.
He's literally running for his life.
He is. He scrambles over a wall to get away, looks back, and a rich young man named Alcander lunges at him and hits him in the face with a staff.
And takes out one of his eyes.
It's a horrific, permanent injury. Lycurgus is standing there, blood just running down his face. And this is the moment that is meant to define the entire Spartan ethos.
What does he do?
He doesn't kill Alcander. He doesn't let his bodyguards tear the kid to pieces. He just stands there silent and shows the mob his ruined face.
He shames them with his own suffering.
Instantly, the mob is completely cowed by this display of restraint. They hand Alcander over to Lycurgus, expecting a brutal execution. And Lycurgus takes the boy into his own home.
Wait, he takes him home?
He makes Alcander live with him, serve him his meals, and just watch him. It's a rehabilitation program.
That's incredible.
It is. Alcander expects to be tortured or killed. Instead, he sees Lycurgus' incredible discipline, his moderation, his work ethic. And over time, Alcander transforms from this violent, entitled youth into the most devoted, loyal Spartan of them all. It's a perfect microcosm of the whole political project. Lycurgus takes a violent, chaotic people and, through discipline and example, molds them into a perfect instrument.
And once that instrument is perfectly tuned, he finds a way to lock it in forever. The final act of his life is this brilliant, brutal, legal trick.
The ultimate bind. He calls a full assembly of the Spartan people, and he says, "The laws are good, but there's one final small adjustment I need to make. I have to check with the oracle at Delphi. So swear an oath, all of you, that you will not change a single one of my laws until I return."
And because they trust him now, or maybe because they fear him, they all swear the oath.
They swear. He goes to Delphi. The oracle gives him the ultimate validation, saying, "Sparta will be the most famous city in the world as long as it keeps your laws."
Well, his work is done.
His work is done. But he realizes that if he goes home, he releases them from their oath. They would be free to change things. So he decides to never go home. He just stays away from Sparta and starves himself to death.
He weaponizes his own death to freeze the state in time.
It's a powerful statement. It implies that the laws are so perfect, but also so fragile, that human nature would inevitably corrupt them unless it was bound by a divine, unbreakable oath.
So let's look at this perfect system he died for, the so-called Great Rhetra. Now, this isn't a written constitution like the one we have today, is it?
No, not at all. Lycurgus supposedly explicitly forbade written laws.
Why?
He believed that if laws were written down, people would just become lawyers. They'd find loopholes, argue over interpretations. He wanted the laws to be ingrained in the habits and the character of the people. The Great Rhetra was an oral pronouncement, supposedly the exact words of the oracle delivered to him.
And it sets up this very strange hybrid government structure.
It's what political scientists call a mixed constitution. It's trying to balance different forms of power. First, you have the monarchy. Two kings from two different families, the Agiads and the Eurypontids, to check each other's power. One couldn't become a tyrant if the other was always there to oppose him. They served as the generals and the high priests. Then you have the Gerousia.
The Council of Elders, the Senate, basically.
Exactly. 28 men over the age of 60, plus the two kings, making 30 total. They held office for life, and they acted as the high court. And then you have the Appella.
The assembly of all the citizens.
Right, all the citizen males. They would gather and vote on proposals from the Gerousia, usually by shouting or clanging their spears on their shields.
But the Rhetra has this little catch, a sort of poison pill clause known as the writer.
This is the really controversial bit. The Rhetra says that the people have the final say and the ultimate power, but if the people speak crookedly, the kings and the elders have the right to set aside the decision and dismiss the assembly.
Speaking crookedly. That is just incredibly vague. It sounds like a break glass in case of democracy box.
It absolutely was. It ensured that the aristocracy, the elders, always had the final check. If the mob got too rowdy or voted for something the elites thought was dangerous, the Gerousia could just say, "Nope, that was a crooked vote." Veto.
So it's democracy with an asterisk.
A very large asterisk.
But there is one really important group missing from the Rhetra, and they are usually the villains in any story you hear about Sparta. The E-Force.
The overseers, yes, these were 5 magistrates elected annually who held immense power in later Spartan history.
How much power?
They could fine citizens. They basically ran foreign policy, and they could even arrest and imprison the kings. They were a huge deal.
And Herodotus says Lycurgus created them.
Herodotus does. But almost all modern scholars, and even some ancient ones like Aristotle, say he didn't. The effort likely emerged much later, probably in the 7th century, well after any plausible date for Lycurgus.
So why the confusion?
It was probably a concession to the common people, a way for them to check the power of the kings and the Gerousia. But because the ephors became so powerful over time, the Spartans had to retroactively claim Lycurgus invented them.
To give them legitimacy.
Exactly. You can't have the most powerful office in your state not be part of the founder's grand plan. So they just edited the history. Oh yes, Lycurgus definitely meant for us to have ephors. It was all part of the design.
It's amazing how much of this is just retroactive justification. Let's move from the political structure to the social structure, because this is what makes Sparta Sparta. This is the engineering of the soul that people talk about. And it starts with dinner.
The syssitia, the common mess. This was arguably Lycurgus's most radical tool for breaking the private sphere.
Breaking the family unit.
Completely. In other Greek cities, you went home at night, you ate with your wife and your kids in your own house. In Sparta, that was forbidden for citizen males. You had to eat every single night in a communal dining hall with your mess, a group of about 15 men.
And this wasn't some kind of charity soup kitchen. You had to pay to get in.
This is a detail that just shatters the popular image of Spartan equality. It was a club with dues. You had to contribute a set amount of barley, wine, cheese, and figs every single month from your own farm.
And what happened if you couldn't pay?
If you couldn't pay, maybe your farm had a bad year, maybe you inherited a smaller plot of land, you were kicked out.
And if you're kicked out of the mess?
You lose your citizenship. You become what they called an inferior. You lose your political rights, your social standing, everything. So the system was inherently designed to filter out the poor. It created an elite warrior class, not a broad democracy of equals.
But the purpose of the mess wasn't just exclusion, it was about cohesion, right?
Oh, absolutely. The idea was that you ate the same simple black broth as the king. You listened to the same old war stories. Your primary loyalty was transferred from your biological family, your parents and brothers, to your military unit, your sworn band.
Speaking of wealth and exclusion, we have to talk about the famous iron money. The legend is that Lycurgus banned gold and silver because he saw it as the root of all evil.
The story goes that he collected all the gold and silver in Sparta and replaced it with these things called pelliners, which were large, heavy iron bars.
But not just iron.
Right. He supposedly dipped them in vinegar while they were red hot to make them brittle and useless. You couldn't even melt them down to make a tool or a weapon.
So if I want to sell my harvest for a profit, I end up with a literal ton of useless iron sitting in my house. I can't bribe anyone, I can't trade with Athens, I can't hide my wealth.
It enforced economic isolation, and it kind of forced austerity. But again, the history traps us here. Lycurgus is supposed to be living in the 9th or 8th century BC.
And when was money actually invented?
Minted coinage, actual gold and silver coins, didn't really arrive in Greece until the mid-6th century BC. So Lycurgus could not have banned coins that didn't exist yet.
So what's the real story behind the iron money?
What likely happened is that while the rest of the Greek world moved on to using sophisticated silver coins, Sparta stubbornly stuck to the old archaic system of using iron spits as currency. They were just technologically and economically conservative.
And later on, they spun that.
Later on, when they looked around and saw everyone else getting rich off of trade, they rationalized their own backwardness as a profound moral choice. We don't use gold because our great founder Lycurgus wanted us to be humble and pure, not we don't use gold because we hate change and can't figure out banking.
It's incredible how every single quirk of their society gets this profound moral justification. But the most intense justification of all involves the children. The agoge.
The rearing. This was the state education system, and it was brutal. At the age of 7, all Spartan boys were taken from their mothers and put into communal herds. They were no longer sons of a family, they were wards of the state.
And the conditions were designed to be horrific.
It was calculated brutality. They were given one cloak to wear for the entire year, summer and winter, no shoes. They had to sleep on beds made of reeds that they had to pluck from the riverbank with their bare hands. And they were deliberately underfed.
To encourage them to steal.
To teach them stealth and cunning. If you stole food and got away with it, you were praised. If you were caught, you were whipped savagely.
But not for stealing.
Not for stealing, for being bad at it, for getting caught.
But the darkest part of this whole education system is something that gets left out of the movies and the graphic novels, the cryptia.
The Secret Service, or maybe more accurately, the Secret Police. This was the final graduation test for the most promising young men in the agoge. They were sent out into the countryside with nothing but a dagger and the clothes on their back.
And their mission wasn't just survival.
No, their mission was to terrorize the Helot population.
The Helots being the state-owned slaves.
Yes, a massive population of Greeks whom the Spartans had conquered and enslaved. The Helots vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens, maybe by as much as 7-1. The Spartans lived in constant paranoid fear of a revolt.
So the cryptio was a form of population control.
The most brutal form imaginable. The young men would hide by day and stalk the fields and roads by night. If they saw a Helot who was too strong, too smart, too charismatic, or looked like a potential leader, they murdered him in the dark and disappeared.
It's state-sponsored serial killing, aimed at the best and brightest of the slave class.
It was even framed as a kind of religious warfare. Every single year, the ephors would formally declare war on the Helots, just so that killing them wouldn't be considered a religiously polluting act of murder. It was a ritual cleansing of their own territory.
And this, too, was attributed to Lycurgus.
Some ancient sources try to distance him from it, saying it was a later, corrupt addition. But others, like Plato, see it as an absolutely integral part of the Lycurgan system. You cannot have the good order of the Spartan citizens without the absolute terroristic suppression of the slaves who do all the work.
That brings us then to the other half of the population, the women. Sparta has this reputation for being, somewhat feminist compared to the rest of ancient Greece.
Feminist is definitely a modern projection. It was, like everything else in Sparta, utilitarian. But yes, compared to an Athenian woman who was basically locked in the house her entire life to weave wool, a Spartan woman had an incredible amount of freedom.
Lycurgus, or the laws attributed to him, ordered that girls should exercise.
Publicly. Running, wrestling, throwing the discus and the javelin, sometimes even in the nude, just like the boys. But we have to be really clear about the why. It wasn't about empowerment or equality.
It was eugenics.
Pure eugenics. The lawgiver believed that strong, athletic women produce strong, healthy sons for the army. The logic was that a plant grown in good soil will be stronger than one grown in poor soil. The woman's body was the soil for the state's crop of soldiers.
The woman is a machine for producing soldiers.
Exactly. And to ensure that machine worked at peak efficiency, Lycurgus instituted some very, very strange marriage customs. The idea of bride capture, for instance.
This sounds more like a kidnapping than a wedding ceremony.
It is a ritualized abduction. The groom would symbolically seize his bride. She would then be taken away by her bridesmaids to a dark room. Her head would be shaved to the scalp, and she would be dressed in a man's cloak and sandals.
Why the shaved head in the man's clothes?
The theory is it was to make the initial sexual encounter less jarring for the young Spartan men, who had spent their entire lives only with other males in the agauge. The bride was made to look more like a boy.
So what happened next?
She was laid on a mattress in the dark. The groom would then leave his military mess, sneak into the house, consummate the marriage in secret, and then sneak back to the barracks to sleep with the other men before dawn.
So they are officially married, but they are still living apart.
For years, sometimes. Plutarch says they might have 2 or 3 children before they ever saw each other's faces in the daylight.
And what was the logic behind that?
Lycurgus argued that this secrecy kept the sexual tension and desire high. If you're around your wife all the time, you get bored, you get comfortable, and your offspring will be weak. But if every encounter is a secret illicit act, the passion is greater and the seed will be more vigorous.
It's all just relentless biological engineering.
It gets even more radical than that. He supposedly endorsed wife sharing.
This is a part of the story that usually stops people in their tracks.
Lycurgus didn't view marriage as a possessive, romantic contract. The goal was to produce the best possible children for the state. So as an older man had a beautiful young wife, but was past his prime, he was encouraged to find a younger, stronger, more accomplished warrior to impregnate her.
And the husband is supposed to be okay with this.
He's supposed to be proud of it. The child would be legally his, raised in his household, but it would have the superior genetics of the biological father. Plutarch quotes Lycurgus saying, "Why should a man be jealous about his wife when he happily lends his best dogs and horses to his neighbors for breeding?"
The woman is literally compared to livestock.
The goal is the best possible stock for the state. Private jealousy is just a selfish, un-Spartan emotion that gets in the way.
But here is where the expert context is so vital. Was this really an ancient law from the 9th century? Or is this another retrojection?
That is the big question. And many, many historians believe these radical breeding programs were a much later reaction to a specific crisis called oliganthropia,
Which means?
a shortage of men. By the 5th and 4th centuries BC, Sparta was bleeding manpower. They lost men in constant wars, and because of the strict inheritance laws and the cost of the mess dues, fewer and fewer men qualified as full citizens. The citizen body was shrinking dangerously.
So the state was literally dying out.
It was on the verge of collapse. So these bizarre wife-sharing rules might have been desperate, late attempts to boost the birth rate by any means necessary. But to get the proud Spartan men to agree to it, the authorities couldn't say, "We need a new weird rule." They had to say.
This is what Lycurgus always wanted.
Exactly. It always comes back to him. If you need to change your society in a radical way, you have to pretend you aren't changing it at all. You're just restoring the ancient custom.
And this leads us to the biggest myth of them all, the one that really stuck in the Western imagination for 2,000 years. The idea that Lycurgus made everyone equal.
The homoioi, the equals. The story, as told by Plutarch, is that when Lycurgus took power, he saw that Sparta was deeply divided. A few rich people owned all the land, and the poor were starving and landless. So he did something incredibly radical. He confiscated all the land in Laconia.
A total forced redistribution.
Yes. He divided into 30,000 equal lots for the provincials and 9,000 prime lots for the Spartiates, the full citizens. Every citizen got an equal plot of land, a kleros, which was supposed to be enough to support his family and pay his mess dues forever.
This is the story that made Lycurgus a hero to the French Revolution, to early socialists, to anyone, really, who dreams of a world without wealth inequality. But you're telling me it never happened.
It is almost certainly a lie.
Yeah.
And unlike some of the other myths, we can pinpoint almost exactly when and why this lie was invented.
Okay, go on.
It comes from the 3rd century BC. This is the twilight of Sparta. The city is a shadow of its former self. Real power and wealth have concentrated into the hands of about 100 families. Many of them, interestingly, were wealthy heiresses. The rest of the so-called citizens are destitute.
So the legendary equality is gone.
It was never there to begin with. But in the 240s BC, two reformist kings, Agis IV and later Cleomenes III, they wanted to save the dying state. They proposed a truly radical plan: cancel all debts and redistribute all the land.
That is a very hard sell. The rich are going to try and kill you for suggesting that.
And they eventually did kill Agis. But to sell this radical plan, Agis and Cleomenes didn't say, "We are inventing a new communist system." They said, "We are returning to the original laws of our founder, Lycurgus." They invented the story that Lycurgus had originally divided the land equally, and that greed and corruption had ruined his perfect vision.
They invented a fake egalitarian past to justify a radical egalitarian future.
It is the ultimate political spin. And we know it's fake because of our old friend, the poet Tyrtaeus. Remember, he was writing way back in the 7th century.
Right, our earliest source.
In his surviving poems, he actually references people clamoring for land redistribution. He talks about the problem of wealth inequality in his own time. Well, if Lycurgus had already solved the land problem and made everyone equal back in the 9th century, why would people still be fighting about it in the 7th century?
That timeline doesn't work.
It doesn't. So the socialist Sparta was a mirage. It was a piece of brilliant propaganda created by desperate kings 500 years after the fact.
And Plutarch, who wrote the famous biography that we all read, he relied heavily on the histories written during and after that 3rd century propaganda campaign. So the Lycurgus we know is essentially a character created by political spin doctors.
That's a harsh way to put it, but it's largely true.
And that completely reframes his legacy. Because the idea of Lycurgus, this disciplined, egalitarian, state-building genius, went on to have this immense influence on the whole world.
It traveled far beyond the ruins of Sparta. The Romans loved him. They saw him as a precursor to their own brand of republican severity. But his reputation really explodes during the Enlightenment.
And with one man in particular, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Rousseau was absolutely obsessed with Lycurgus. For him, Lycurgus was the proof that you can denature humanity. You can take a human being who is naturally selfish and individualistic, and through the power of the state and education, you can turn him into a creature who only cares about the collective good. He called it submitting to the general will.
But the American founders, they were a bit more wary, weren't they?
They had a real love-hate relationship with Sparta. John Adams and James Madison, they studied Lycurgus very closely when designing their own republic. They liked the structure, the idea of a mixed constitution, a senate, checks and balances to create stability.
But they hated the result.
They hated the result. Adams had this great line about it. He said, Lycurgus created a society of monks bearing arms. He saw Sparta as a cultural and economic dead end. They were poor, they were brutal, and they didn't produce any great art or philosophy or science. The American project was about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Spartan project was about death, obedience, and the pursuit of endless war.
But in the 20th century, that idea of monks bearing arms found a new and truly terrifying audience.
The Nazis, German nationalists in the 19th and 20th centuries, fell completely in love with the Spartan Mirage. And Hitler specifically praised Sparta as the first Volkisch state, the first truly racial state.
They looked at the Agoj and saw the Hitler Youth.
They looked at the eugenics, the obsession with physical purity, the state-sponsored murder of imperfect infants, the subjugation of the inferior helots, and they saw a perfect blueprint for their own ideology. They stripped away all the nuance and weaponized Lycurgus as a proto-fascist icon.
It is genuinely terrifying how flexible this ghost is. You can use him to argue for radical equality, like the French revolutionaries, or you can use him to argue for racial supremacy, like the Nazis.
And that is the paradox of the empty vessel. Because we know so little about the real man, if he ever existed, he becomes a mirror. Every era looks at Lycurgus and sees what it wants to see. If you desire order, he's the ultimate disciplinarian. If you want equality, he's the first socialist. If you want racial purity, he's the first eugenicist.
He is whatever the state needs him to be at that moment.
Which brings us all the way back to the original question of why he exists at all. Why invent him in the first place?
Because it's hard to follow a rule if you think just another guy like you made it up.
Exactly. Societies, especially pre-modern ones, struggle to accept that their laws are just agreements, that they are messy, temporary human compromises. That's a scary thought. It means the ground beneath your feet is unstable.
But if the laws come from a founder, a semi-divine genius who got them directly from the god Apollo at Delphi, then the ground is solid rock. The laws aren't up for debate.
It creates eunomia. That good order isn't just about the laws themselves. It's about the unshakable belief in the laws. The Spartans needed Lycurgus the myth far more than they ever needed Lycurgus the man.
So we are left with a ghost. A man who likely didn't exist, credited with laws he probably didn't write, enforcing a social equality that never happened. And yet, that powerful story, that ghost, held one of the most formidable military states in history together for centuries.
The story was always stronger than the reality.
And that's the thought I think I want to leave you with. We look back at the Spartans and we think, how could they believe in this obvious myth? But are we really any different? What origin stories do we tell ourselves about our own founders, our constitutions, our national characters that maybe mask the messy, complicated, and often ugly reality of how we actually got here?
That is the dangerous question, isn't it?
Thanks for diving deep with us.
My pleasure.